Welcome back to another episode of Psychocinematic. Today I have another special guest. His name is Carlos Rosario, and he was the costume designer on Shogun. Super pumped to talk to him. Shogun's amazing. If you haven't seen it yet, highly recommend checking it out on Hulu. And on top of being the costume designer for Shogun, he also has a pretty stacked resume. It's insane. We get into it a little bit in this podcast, but without further ado, here's Carlos. Well, Carlos, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're probably super busy. Before I start picking your brain about your costume designing on Shogun, I would like to know, just a brief bit about your background, how you got into all this, just to give me some more context about you as a whole.
Well, yeah, I started as an illustrator first, costume illustrator. My first job was on Batman and Robin. So I did all the drawings for Uma Thurman and Poison Ivy and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it was with George Clooney. So that was really, really fun. And so that was my first experience in the movie industry. So I started as a costume illustrator. After that, I met Colin Atwood, who's, a four Oscar. She has four Oscars. And I've worked for her also as an illustrator on many projects like Sleepy Hollow, Planet of the Apes, Lemony Snicket. She worked a lot with Tim Burton. So that was very exciting. And I worked with her for a long time. But then I started, working as an assistant designer. And so some of the projects that I worked on were Tron Legacy, Walk the Line, Three Kings, and then after a while, Captain America too. But after a while, I decided to start being a costume designer. It was my time to kind of jump to the next step. And so my first movie as a costume designer was actually the last movie that Robin Williams did. It was called Boulevard. And then after that, I started designing. I met Fede Alvarez, who is the director on, Don't Breathe One. And, we just did actually the new Alien, Alien Romulus. It's coming out this summer. And actually the teaser trailer just came out today.
Yeah, watch that. Looks great.
It looks good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked with it a little bit, and then just all that, led me to Shogun. We started Shogun in early 2021.
Dang, that's crazy. So first of all, so cool that you worked on Batman and Robin. Just growing up, I was always this huge Batman fan, and I probably had that movie as well as all the other original Batman on repeat. So that's super cool that you were illustrating those costumes.
It was amazing. And at the end, it became like a very iconic project, right? It just became very iconic.
Being the costume designer on Shogun, what all goes into that role? Are you the lead of the department, or are you basically the very first person going into it?
Yes, I am the first person to be hired, definitely in the costume department. And so I am the leader of a big team of very talented artists that I feel are costume designers on their own, but each one of them has their own expertise. So I have assistants that support me to make sure that all my ideas, are getting to the right places so things are executed the right way. They follow up with everything that needs to happen. I have supervisors that take care of all the financial, parts of my department, coordinating everything. Then I have textile artists. I have a workroom with cutter feeders. And then, of course, yes, I have illustrators. I have people on set that dress the actors. So it's a big team of, it's a group effort. Specifically in Shogun, it's such a big project that, we were about 125 people in Vancouver working on the project. And that's not counting, all the other teams that we had around the world, kind of, making the armors, making the stock for the peasants, for the uniforms for the samurais, finding the fabrics in Japan. So it was a big team. And on top of the pyramid, I am the leader that leads all that group of people. I work very closely with all of them. And, as they always say, it takes an army to make the costumes for a project like this. But in this case, I think it just took, literally 5 countries. So it was pretty ambitious.
Wow. Yeah. So How many costumes did you guys make for this? Do you know?
So I think we made about 2,300
Oh my
costumes.
God.
But, we also rendered about 1,200 pieces that came directly from Japan that I thought were good character pieces, for example, for the peasants,
Mhm.
or things that, we needed in quantity, right, for
Mhm.
background. We also bought a lot of modern kimonos that we altered so it would have the same shape as the kimonos of that period. And the kimonos of
Mhm.
that period are called kosodes. So I bought a lot of those vintage kimonos, modern kimonos, to be able to use them as underlayers.
Mhm.
So at the end of the day, we had a big, huge warehouse full of costumes, but we made about 2,300 costumes. We made all the armors and all the fabrics came from Japan.
So, if you guys started working on this in 2021, when did they begin shooting? How long were you given to make all these?
I started my first day in Vancouver on my own was May 1st, 2021. I was on my own. There was nobody else at that point. And we started shooting in September 22nd of 2021. And, it always happens like that on every single project. Usually the most ambitious costumes always start shooting on the first day of shooting. And so in this case, you know that in the first episode, when you see all the Green Army on the beach, well, that was actually the first day of shooting on Shogun.
Mhm.
And so, we didn't have much time to make those armors and all the other armors that we needed to have ready for the next couple of days. So we had about 5 months of prep, but, considering the armors took a long time to make, it wasn't, as much as, people would think, right? And so it was
Mhm.
always being working around the clock and really fast to put things into manufacturing, doing all the design of the armors, and then coming up with the concepts and the design of all the other costumes.
So, while the shooting is happening, you guys are still working on costumes that are coming in a later episode? Wow.
Correct. So basically, those first 5 months helped to design the armors because we knew we needed as much time as possible to make them. And then we focused on the costumes for the first and the second episode, right? And then that's the way it works on TV is that, well, you start shooting, and as soon as you start shooting, you start prepping the following episodes. So as soon as we started episode one, we were thinking about episode three. As soon as we started
Mhm.
episode second, we started thinking about episode four and five. The one that was probably the most ambitious was episode six, which is
Okay.
coming next
So, I haven't seen it
week.
yet.
And that one is so ambitious that we had to start prepping about 4 months before the episode,
Wow.
before we started shooting that episode. But usually that's the way it happens. You're shooting the episode, and at the same time, you're prepping the costumes for the following episodes. So it never
Mhm.
stops. Once you are in, it's kind of like nonstop work.
Do you get consulted during the shooting about costume choices for the episode that they are actively shooting? Like, do they decide that they need to change something?
It's really rare that that happens because these costumes are so complicated, they're so expensive. And, before the costumes get to the trailer for the actor to wear it, there's been a lot of talks about it before. You have to
Mhm.
talk to the showrunners about the concept, for the costumes of the character. You'll have to talk to the actor also about what you think is the appropriate costume for that scene. Then you make the outfit, then you do the fittings, then you
Mhm.
show the pictures of the fitting to everybody, the showrunners, the studio, the actors, the producers, right? And so once you have the green light from everybody, then that costume is done. You put it in the trailer and the actor wears it on the day. It happens that sometimes something unexpected happens, that maybe there's been a confusion, maybe the director decided to shoot the scene in a different way. Sometimes they change the schedule. And so usually what they do is that they contact me and we talk on the phone and we find a solution to figure out what is the other best costume that could work for that scene. But
Mhm.
usually everything happens before, anything goes to set.
And what about the considerations, if any, are made for scenes with violence? Like the end of episode 4, for example, costumes are being destroyed. Is someone on set getting ready to make that? Or is there a separate outfit that was identical, now they put that on? Or is it just visual effects, CG, that they're destroying these costumes?
For any action scene and any scene that requires blood, we always make multiples. So, we have the hero costume that always stays clean. But when you get into blood, you need to change it to, the second costume, the third costume, right? And then you also have the stunt person wearing the same costume, right?
Wow.
Um, so, it's not just what you see on screen, is that you have to make all the multiples to make that scene work, right? In specifically for that scene, I'll tell you what happens. I think Michael Clyde was our visual effects producer, and he's the one that made that scene look so incredibly impactful. When we shot it, it wasn't that bloody, it wasn't that violent, and he made it look absolutely. I saw it and I was really impressed with his work. It looks amazing, it looks beautiful. And so, yes, we did have to dress sort of, legs and arms, fake legs and
Yeah.
fake arms with pieces of armors that we had. So we had to destroy some of our armor pieces in order to dress those limbs, right? And then I think we added some blood, but at the end of the day, Michael added even more blood and added everything that you see on screen that is really more violent. It's part of VFX. Yes, it's CG,
Right.
really.
I saw your post about how much you love the symbolism in clothing, and you pointed out what you had done with Ishido's one of his many costumes with the pheasants on it, and symbolizing that Toranaga was hunting for pheasants, showing that they're actively against each other. And what I'm curious, because I'm sure like every character's got loads of symbolism that you put in there, with John Blackthorne, with his more commoner type clothing. Are there things that you designed or you guys are having him do differently to symbolize something, like maybe tied it wrong or something like that?
Well, I mean, in the beginning, when he's dressed for the first time with the kosode, right? The kosode is the ancestor to the kimono. He's dressed by, those maids, right? That are in that. And they are the ones who tie the obi. I remember that at that moment, we spoke about it with the showrunner. And I think if I remember properly, that since they were tying it, we wanted to make the right knot, right? For the but I think for him, his concept is probably not as symbolic as all the other characters. I think for him, it was more about, well, they removed from him his sort of European clothes, right? His breeches and his blouse. And that's a way to sort of remove the identity that he comes with, right? His identity from being a European, Englishman, right? And he's sort of forced to wear this kosode, this Japanese, very basic, traditional garment. It was interesting that we started with something very basic and very simple, because it gave me the possibility that later on I would start adding more Japanese clothing into his wardrobe.
Gotcha.
As a way to show that slowly he's, sort of, emerging himself into the Japanese culture, or they are imposing the Japanese culture on him.
Right.
So he sort of, all his identity is removed from him. And so he's really influenced by the Japanese culture, and you see it through his clothing. And it's interesting because in a way that really affected his way of moving, his way of talking, right? Because the clothing of that period are so restrictive. You have all these hakama pants with, these gaiters and the pleats on the hakama pants, and you have, all these obis, and everything needs to be tied in a very specific way. It's so structured in a way. And so, he's not used to that. And I thought that was really kind of interesting to see the evolution from, a very basic kosode to then slowly having all this Japanese clothes sort of, imposed on him, right?
Right.
And in terms of the colors, it was good to keep it very muted, very simple. It needed to contrast from everybody else because even though he's one of the lead actors, he's also very powerless in that
Hmm.
environment, right? So it was important to keep it very simple so we could see the contrast with the luxurious fabrics that all the lords were wearing.
That's really cool that throughout the entire show, there's the evolution of him, basically
Yeah,
assimilating into that culture a little bit more. That's awesome.
exactly.
I also saw your post on Instagram about, I think his name, Nabuya's samurai outfit and how there's a nature theme with all the armies. Is
Mhm.
that something that was like a historical accuracy, or is that your touch that you're throwing in on it because you just want there to be this like beautiful color coding with the armies and what they stand for, that kind of thing?
So for the armies, for the colors for the armies, they were already described in those colors in the novel. So
Hmm.
James Clavell described Ishido's army as the gray army, and he described Toranaga's army as the brown army, right? When I read the script for the first time, it was there. And actually that was my starting point of designing this show with those colors in mind, right? So I thought, well, if Ishido's army is gray, then by extension, it's the color of their lord, of Ishido, right? Same for Toranaga. And so I created all these different color palettes for all the different lords, all the different armies, right? For Yabu, it was the green, for Kiyama, it's the red. Everybody had their own specific color palette. And I decided to go a little bit further with that concept. And so I started to think, well, I cannot dress Ishido just with gray because it's going to be too monochromatic. What can I
Hmm.
do to sort of create a bit of contrast so it would allow me to play with more colors, more fabrics? And I thought, well, maybe it's the concept of fire and ash. And
Hmm.
so that's when I introduced the orange into Ishido and its army, right?
Yeah.
And so for everybody else, they have their own concept that is related to nature or elements from nature, right? And that
Hmm.
was my way to sort of start creating very specific containers for each character, each lord, and each army. And that was much easier for me to then decide what they were going to wear, because at
Right.
least I had a very good, strong color palette at that point.
Yeah. And it seems like if you got, maybe you felt like you were going off the rails in the design process, you could refer back to, well, is this one still like water? Something like that.
Exactly, exactly. Because on a show like this, I mean, there's so many characters, right? And so
Hmm.
many costumes that need to be designed. I think it was important to create very strong boundaries with all these different groups of people. And that was very useful.
After making over 2,000 costumes or, also renting and all this stuff, besides the ones that were rented, what happens with all these costumes after they're done shooting?
For right now, I mean, obviously, all these costumes are very expensive and they took a lot of time to make. Well, I mean, at this point, I think, they are in a warehouse with all the props, with also some of the boats, the sets. And so since we finished shooting in July of 2022, obviously there were a couple of months of wrapping the show, and they put all the elements, all the costumes together in a warehouse. And I assume that at some point, I don't know what the next step is, but I assume that at some point, um, you know, at least in terms of costumes, they will go to their archives, you know. And so they usually keep those costumes. I mean, some of them could go back into rentals, maybe they could sell them, but I can guarantee you that the ones for the lead characters, they will keep them in their archives.
Gotcha. So you're telling me you don't have a samurai outfit somewhere in your house?
No, exactly. No.
Damn
I don't think
it.
that were too expensive. They wouldn't allow me to keep one. So yeah. I mean, I know that some actors kept a couple of pieces here and there, but usually they were only allowed to keep it if we had made multiples of that piece.
Hmm.
Otherwise, if it's a hero piece and there is only one, it goes back to the archives.
Gotcha. My last question for you is how much time did you have to spend researching Japanese culture at this period to become well versed enough with the outfits of the time period?
I mean, I think that the research was from the first day to literally the last day. I mean, I was literally packing and they were still shooting a few scenes. And I was still doing research for a scene that happens in episode 10 that is very different from everything else. You know, it was research from the beginning to the end. Japanese clothing seems very simple, but it's very complex. It's just very complicated and has so many nuances. And like we talked before, the patterns also, every pattern means something, right? And depending on the rank, depending on the location, depending on the circumstances, depending on the character, it requires a completely different costume. And also we had the no theater scene, we had funerals, we had weddings, we had so many different scenes within the 10 episodes that are so different from everything else. Also flashbacks. So for everything, every time, every scene, we needed to go back to the research. We needed to speak with experts. We needed to speak with historians in order to make sure that we were designing the right costumes, right? And I think that what really helped us the most was definitely studying the paintings of that period. Because at the end of the day, it really is, going back to the roots of what really was authentic about that period. If you go and watch Japanese movies, it's the interpretation of the director, it's the interpretation, the costumes are the interpretation of the costume designer, right? And for us, we didn't want to go through all those filters. So we went straight to the paintings and also museum pieces, that we found that still exist and that we could just study and look at and and get inspired by. So that was really pretty much the research process. It was endless. I mean, I remember that one of the producers kept the research for everything, and she put together a 1,000 pages book about all the research we did about pretty much everything for the 10
That's
episodes.
crazy.
It was pretty crazy, yes.
The Shogun Bible.
Exactly, it was the Shogun Bible. But that really shows you how authentic, the
Yeah.
showrunners and the producers in the studio wanted to be with everything.
Well, that's all incredible to hear. I'm so grateful that you came on here to share with me all the insights on, designing the costumes for Shogun. And I really hope after I get a chance to see Alien Romulus, you'll come back on and talk to me about that.
Absolutely, with pleasure.
Love sci-fi.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll come back. But thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Of course. Thank you.